Yep. Okay.
So before you did that, I should have caveated that I'm not promising this is going to be smooth for recording. But anyhow, we did want to come out and chat with you guys. All of us on the, presenting today are WPI alumni. So we all went to WPI. I went there before there was an IMTD, but we all went because we wanted to make computer games. That was, I think, a big, reason for why we got into the field. And then we've gone off to work at MITRE, where we're actually able to kind of, tie in our passion for making games with, doing something, kind of for the good of the country, for our government sponsors. That is not necessarily, just your typical game for fun. So we're designing series. We design and implement serious games. This talk is titled, for behavioral research, but we do it for other things as well. Aiden's going to share a little bit with you guys later on about a game that we've put together that's really more in the field of education. So just to get us started, I think a good, question many folks may have is what exactly are serious games? And there's a lot of different definitions out there. There's some that I really don't like that try to, shoehorn us into something like a digital format. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I like this definition that Chen and Michael came up with back in 2005, which is games that do not have entertainment, enjoyment, or fun as their primary purpose. So you've got some other purpose other than entertainment when you put this game together. Now, a couple caveats. All games must be fun. So it does still need to be enjoyable and fun. If it's not, then I basically say that's not a game. So I've seen a number of different serious game attempts that I look at and I say, that's not a game because it's not fun. It's some boring process. You put a scoreboard on top of it and you called it a game, and it's not. So it needs to be fun. And then I don't know if folks on the call are familiar with the concept of serious gaming. That's something, it's a slightly different concept. And so that is where we take a game that was created for entertainment purposes, and we find serious purposes to use it on afterwards. So it wasn't created right from the get-go as a serious game. And that's really the differentiator. A really great example of serious gaming is Dance Dance Revolution. If folks are familiar with Dance Dance Revolution, it's a game where basically you have to kind of move your feet on a pad to the rhythm of music that's playing in the game. They've been able to show a lot of good serious uses of Dance Dance Revolution. Obviously, it can be good for exercise, for health in general, but they were able to actually show that they could slightly reverse and then slow the progression of Parkinson's disease through the use of Dance Dance Revolution. So having people who have developed Parkinson's disease play Dance Dance Revolution, they're able to slow the progression of their disease. And so that's a great example of serious gaming, where we've taken a game that was developed for an entertainment purpose and we found a good serious purpose for it. And that's not what we do. So I just spent a lot of time describing not what we do. What we are doing is more we have a primary purpose, some sort of serious purpose that we want to achieve, and now we're going to design and implement a game that will help us achieve that. And so here's just kind of a general spread of a bunch of different examples of types of serious games. What can you use serious games for? America's Army is a very popular example of a game that was put together really for recruiting purposes initially, and they were wildly successful in using America's Army for recruiting purposes. But then they also extended that to training, and so they actually conducted some training of their folks through the game. So that game was primarily created for recruiting, but it's also what has been used for training. This game has been used for marketing, instituting social or cultural change. There's a really powerful example, a game called A Force More Powerful, that was developed and released to folks in the, in the Arab area about 5 years before the Arab Spring, which taught people how to overthrow governments in a nonviolent manner. So it was I forget exactly, the Institute for like Nonviolent Warfare or something like that. They basically funded the game, taught people how to overthrow dictatorships and such governments that they didn't like without doing it in a violent way. And then 5 years later, we had the Arab Spring. So there's no direct, there's certainly information that shows that people who were involved in the Arab Spring did have access to the game and actually were able to play the game, but there's no direct scientific data correlating the fact that they played the game to the fact that they achieved these nonviolent overthrows of government. But it's it's certainly very coincidental. So I think that's a great example of how we were able to institute change through a game. I like to kind of break these things down into a couple different categories of observing people, training, and teaching. And so teaching is kind of a broad category in my mind where we're just trying to like tell people about something in hope that they're going to change the way that they're thinking based off of what we're telling them. Training is a little bit more about actually rewiring your brain, right? So that's has more to do with things like when you're doing things repetitively, and so that your brain gets rewired, so you just automatically know how to react in different situations. We have both kind of physical training as well as cognitive training that can take place through serious games. And then observing people. And so we do a lot of this at MITRE as well. The military has long used tabletop games, tabletop exercises for exploring different scenarios. And that's one use of serious games. We've done behavioral experiments, for instance, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, using serious games where we're trying to understand how will people act in these kind of situations, and when we change the environment that they're in, or we change the kind of makeup of the personnel, how does that change the behavior of the people within the system? And then there's games that are just explicitly helping with research. I don't remember if this is yeah, this is actually a screenshot of Fold It, which is a bit dated at this point, but this was an interesting game because they were actually, as people were playing the game, they were contributing to genetic research. So just in the process of playing the game, you were actually furthering research. So just in general, this is kind of how I like to view the landscape of serious games. And this is not inclusive at all. There's certainly lots of other serious purposes that you could use a game for that's not included here. I'll jump over. I'll mention this one real quick, but so there's back about 50 years ago, there was basically a civil war that occurred in the simulation community over what was the right way to conduct simulations. There was a faction that said we need to be doing modeling. There's a faction that said we need to be doing gaming. I think that there's been a lot of progress in people making peace with each other, but there's still a lot of people on one side or the other of this argument about what's the right way to do simulation. And the reality is actually each of these methods bring their own pluses and minuses. And so this is one of the, I like to show this slide just to kind of show some of the reasons why we would use serious games over something like modeling. Modeling is great when you have tons and tons of different factors, right? So if you got hundreds of factors, you're trying to understand how does someone going to work with all these different factors in the system. That's something you can't really handle in a game. You don't want to be throwing hundreds of factors at somebody in a game and expect them to make decisions. But serious games are good for things when we're trying to understand human behavior or human insights and trying to understand a little bit more about why people do things. And serious games give us kind of that a safe environment that people can kind of explore. And they also kind of will bring in some of the social factors that a lot of modeling tools will ignore. So if folks are familiar with game theory, I don't know if that's something you guys talk about, Nash equilibrium, stuff like that. One of the shortfalls I see with a lot of game theory approaches, which game theory really falls more into the field of modeling than serious games. One of the shortcomings of game theory is that it doesn't really incorporates a lot of everything, the full picture. And social factors, for one thing, is something that quite often drops off the table. So if you look at a Nash equilibrium result for a game of this is how people should play it, it's seldom the way that people actually will play that game, because there are these other things such as social factors which are being ignored by game theory. And we won't ignore them when we're doing serious games. So that kind of helps us make sure that we're really getting a good understanding of the behavior that people are going to have in these situations. So I was going to talk a little bit about kind of how do we go about, what's our high level process for developing a serious game. The first and foremost, you need to decide exactly what your purpose is for a game. This usually means that we need to work really closely with the folks that that are trying to achieve that purpose. Quite often, it takes a little bit to get them to figure out what is it we're really trying to achieve. And this is, if any of you are familiar with requirements gathering in general, doing like user requirements, this is a little bit of a skill, right? So what the users say they want is quite often not what they really want, and it takes a little bit of digging to get down to what is it that you're really trying to achieve here. And this is the most important thing. The first thing we do before we start thinking about mechanics or anything else in the game, we need to understand what is the purpose, what is it you're trying to achieve. And then the next thing is to start to scope it. So a lot of the game projects I've been involved in, basically they're like, we would like to figure out how to solve world hunger. And so we need to kind of scope it down and say, okay, well, first off, let's figure out, how do we feed this one country? So scoping is very important. The purpose of your game is going to have to match your scope. It's really important that you don't try to tackle too much. When you have games that are really large scope, and sometimes we have to do games that are fairly large scope, it just makes it a lot harder to actually accomplish your goals. The more you can scope it down to specifically what's the question we're trying to answer, the better chance that you will have of actually being successful in figuring out that answer, and the less data it's going to take. So, instead of, if the scope is really small, maybe I can run like 12 games and get some good confidence that, okay, you know what, everyone's kind of saying the same thing. If it's a really large scope, I might have to run hundreds of games before I have any idea of any confidence in the data that I'm getting. So scope is very important. And I don't know if you guys have learned about things like scope creep. So that's something in systems engineering that you potentially learn about. That's something you want to avoid happening too much. Then we want to define the system itself. So Eric and Aiden and myself are all in the user experience group at MITRE. And so we take a little bit more of a user first perspective. And so I tend to start with the actors in the system. You could start anywhere. The system includes a lot of different components. But I like to kind of look at, okay, who are the players? Who are the stakeholders in the system we're dealing with? What's the relationship between all those stakeholders? And what are kind of their motivations and friction points? What's making them do things? What's stopping them from doing things? And then we need to, you need to look at everything in systems. So you want to look at the environment as well. What are some of the other kind of key elements? What are some of the other external factors that are influencing interactions and how information moves across the system? And we're not going to include all the detail in the game, right? So this is, again, goes back to when you're making a game, you need to simplify things. But when we're understanding the problem, we want to go big. So we go big, we try to understand the whole system as much as possible. And then we start to do, abstraction and reduction and kind of, limit it down to like the factors that are most critical in getting at the behavior we're trying to explore or whatever series purpose we're trying to achieve. So this is just a kind of a use case. This was a claims processing game that we put together. And basically the challenge was there was a huge backlog of cases. They wanted to reduce the backlog of the cases that they had. And they were basically telling their employees, we need you guys to prioritize older cases, but then they weren't seeing that happen. And they didn't understand why was that not happening. We had some MITRE folks go out there. They took a look. They said, we think it's a problem with the performance metrics that you're applying to folks. And so they had some hypotheses about, well, if you change the performance metrics, then people will probably change their behavior and they might do a better job of achieving the goals that you want them to. And that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand is telling people we want X is different than telling people we're measuring Y, because people are always going to work towards what they're being measured on. That's a much stronger motivation. And so we wanted to try to help them understand how could they improve this case prioritization. That was the purpose of the game. And then the scope was to was really focusing on those performance measures, right? If we change those performance measures, is that going to change the way that people are behaving? And so just like a kind of a high level look at like actors in the system, usually we have a little bit more information than this, but just for presentation purposes, I don't want to go too crazy. These are really kind of the primary actors that we identified. So you've got the caseworkers, the people working on the cases. You've got the veterans who are putting in the claims. The caseworkers have their direct management, and then there's upper management that are kind of pushing down and saying, hey, we need you to reduce the caseload. And then we can go out and we can start looking at secondary actors. And so we look and we say, okay, well, the veterans have families, and their families are reliant on the funds that should be coming back from these health claims. The caseworkers have families, and they want to be able to support their families and go back and be with their families. And upper management is getting actually pressure from Congress that they need to make these changes. So these are some of the secondary actors in the system. And then just a couple examples of tertiary actors. The Congress is getting pressure from the president, and the president is actually getting pressure from all these families, right? So all these veteran families were basically complaining that this was an issue. There's enough people who are concerned about this, that the president's concerned about it, that he's applying pressure to the Congress. And of course, the families are also applying pressure to the Congress directly as well. And then you got like hospitals that are basically saying, hey, like, we need our money. And so those are just a couple of examples of tertiary actors. And so we kind of look at the broad picture of who are all the people who are involved. And then again, what we're going to do is we're going to now scope, when we get into this, to the scope, to the abstraction reduction phases of game design, we're going to try to pull this down to who are the most critical people. But we want that wide view to start with. And then just looking at like caseworkers, for example, and looking at their motivations, they're looking to reach the performance goals, right? They want to keep their direct management happy. You always want your manager to be happy with you. Most caseworkers in this case are veterans. So they're actually looking to help their fellow veterans. They're not going into this with like a mercenary attitude, right? They actually want to help these veterans who are putting in claims because they can relate to them. But they also want to be able to spend time with their family. And in the current environment that they were in, they are actually being forced to work mandatory overtime, right? So because there's such a huge backlog, they're being forced to work long hours, which is not good for their family life. So the cases are coming in faster than old cases can be processed. So they get more cases coming in than they're putting out. The cases were frequently handled by numerous people, and that caused problems and errors in the case processing. And then there was also an increase in high priority cases. So these are cases that are supposed to get handled first. Because there was such a backlog, some people were using their influence to make their cases higher priority. And so not only are you trying to deal with this backlog, but now you've got even more cases, new cases coming in that are supposedly high priority cases. And so these are all things that we consider to be important factors in the environment, and all of these things were actually worked into the game itself, all of these factors. And then at the end of the game, we were actually able to show, we basically had an A/B test with the games. So we had people in the A game, they played with the performance metrics. The performance measures that existed today, that was their scoring mechanism. For the B game, we slightly modified the performance metrics. We got rid of quotas, touch quotas for one thing, and we added a timeliness measure. And so the B game participants were playing with a slightly different, with those hypothesized changes, basically, in the performance measures. And so it's not necessarily super easy to read this graphic here, but what this is showing is each of those bars represents a case, and 4 cases came in per round. So what we're seeing here is that blue bar shows the first case that comes in, and everybody had the same exact case order. So everybody got the blue case in first, and then the orange case, and then the gray case, and then the yellow case. Those 4 cases were what they started with. They basically needed to just jump back here. It's hard to see from the picture, but they had human resources that they had to apply to these cases, and they had to decide which cases were priorities. Again, cases are coming in faster than they could be resolved, so the caseload builds over time, and they have to prioritize which of these cases are we handling. They also have other things that they can spend their basically time units, their employees' time on besides doing casework. Which included things such as training or morale events. So all these things were kind of included in the game. And so what we're seeing here is we had approximately 40 people, a little bit under 40 people play each of the versions of the game. And so you can see if you look at the blue bar in the A game, of the approximately 40 people who played the A game, 30 of them finished the first case, the blue case. Of the approximately a little under 40 people who played the B game, I think, I don't know, was that 37 of them actually finished that case. So most of the people finished that first case. In the B game, most of the people finished all the cases that came in the first round, most of the cases that came in the second and third round. And so each of these cases has varying complexity and level of effort that you have to put into them. So what's happening in the A game is we're seeing clear evidence of cherry picking. So in the A game, you know, a number of people, about 25% of the people didn't actually finish the first case and even fewer of them finished that yellow case, which also came in the first round. And so those cases were slightly more complex or required more level of effort, more of your workers' time units to finish that case. And because of the way that they were being measured, the score of the game, as I said, was the performance metrics, the real life performance metrics. They chose not to do those more difficult cases. And so that's what we see, this kind of gappy graph here. You can see kind of where they're prioritizing their time. They're doing it based off of the easier cases, the simpler cases to solve. Whereas in the B game, where we've changed those performance metrics, they really do treat the cases in much more of a first in, first out approach, which is what we were, what the sponsor really wanted their people to be doing. And there's a couple more graphs about, dealing with, as I mentioned, the case complexity and level of effort. And I'm going to skip through this because I think you guys know in general what game design is all about. I think aesthetics is something that's important. Sometimes people in the serious game realm don't think about that enough. In aesthetics, having good aesthetics in a game doesn't necessarily mean high fidelity 3D graphics. I mean, those are great if you can get them. But pixel art games, for instance, are super popular. And so it's really more about having a consistent style and knowing what you're doing and setting up your aesthetics. Being aware of things like shape is valuable. So understanding what shape means in our society, especially if you're doing serious games for people in the US, you want to think about what are the kind of cultural implications of different shapes and stuff in the US. So that's just throwing that one in as something to consider. When we do game testing for serious games, generally the way I look at it is we're generally doing alpha, beta, and then going gold with something. And this is just kind of the things that you can do at each of these stages. Again, very similar to what you would do for a game for fun, except that we're actually trying to make sure that the purpose is being achieved, right? So we have got that extra component of not just testing to see whether or not the game is fun, but is it actually also achieving its purpose? And then, kind of the gut check, are we achieving that purpose? And once again, I always try to nail home for folks, it has to be fun, right? If it's not fun, if it looks like your players are bored, then, then you need to change something in the game. And then at this point, what I wanted to do is we're going to go through and we're going to show a couple examples of other games that we've done here at MITRE. And I'm going to have Eric and Aiden share their experience of working on serious games at MITRE. So we'll start off with the Now We're Talking game. So Aiden, do you want to talk a little bit about what this game was?
You might be a bit more experienced in the elevator pitch of the game.
Well, I can give the high level if you like, and then you can talk about kind of your role. So this game was developed in Unity, and basically the idea here was to try to help veterans in their kind of personal couples relationships. We're looking to try to help veterans save their relationships and prevent breakup of couples, which has been shown to be just upstream of both suicide and homelessness in veterans. And so the purpose of the game was really to kind of teach them some of those good communications behaviors, and also what show them examples of bad communication behaviors, things to avoid. And so as it's really designed as a virtual novel style game, and they're going through and they're each episode in the game is a difficult conversation. So you're having a difficult conversation with your partner. We allow them to customize their partner's appearance. They can make the partner look like anything they want. Within the art set that we have, and they are allowed to assign whatever pronouns they want to the partner and to themselves. And then we actually work the names and pronouns of both the player and their partner into all the dialogue in the game. So it's not just used in the primary dialogue, but it's actually used in like the help text that pops up and everything. So that's part of trying to improve the immersion aspects of the game, by making it really feel as much as possible like you're talking to something that is representing your partner. And then as they're playing through the game, we're measuring up in the top left corner there. You can see there's a couple metrics that we measure out, like how is your relationship kind of doing based off of the responses you're making. And over in the top right corner, there's this virtual therapist that is basically giving them feedback on all the choices that they're making. So Aiden, if you want to take it from there.
Yep. So I've been working on this game for actually since the beginning of my time at MITRE. I've been able to do the front end UI experience work, as well as the internal like kind of behavioral coding of the game. It's been a very valuable experience to kind of practice that all around work on the game, as well as working kind of outside of the normal gaming for fun discipline. If I still have that perspective of making sure it's still fun, easy to use and everything, but getting that exposure to the more serious topic, I've definitely learned a lot more about emotional intelligence working on this game than I knew before. And then keeping in mind all those design considerations, as well as the needs of the game to make sure that it's extensible, usable, and that it's usable and easy enough to develop for the other people, especially like the writers who are not programming the game, to be able to quickly get their dialogues in. The UI design needs to be accessible and easy enough to use for people who might not be experienced with tons of different games and interfaces. There can't be 600 buttons all over the screen to do everything.
Cool. And so, I mean, just I guess one question I would have for you, and I do want to open this up for other folks. Feel free to kind of ask us questions. As we're talking about stuff, I don't know if people can unmute themselves, or if that's something that we're controlling, but
they should have that capability.
Okay. So anyone feel free to jump in. So Aiden, just kind of asking you, what were your expectations coming to work for MITRE when I was basically like, hey, come work for us, versus like now that you've actually been here and you've experienced it, was there anything that was kind of a surprise or anything that was different than what you expected?
So I could say my experience is definitely the non-traditional experience everyone else has had with this past year. I started almost entirely remotely, but I was pretty impressed by how like multi-domain everything is. On this project, I'm working with people who are writers, who are psychologists, and front end, back end. So I've gotten exposed to a lot more different domains than I was expecting. I kind of came in with the expectation that I'd sit down at the desk, do one job, and focus on one tiny area forever. And on this, I get to be, from day one of my time at MITRE, working on a game that it's a fun game to play. It has a serious value behind it, and I get to work with a really broad range of experts on the team.
Cool. Varun, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, it's a general question. Let's say when you work with multiple stakeholders, how do you define fun when it comes to different people? Since fun is very broadly defined in general.
Yeah, and I don't know if let me check and see if I have any slides on that, because I do have slides that I sometimes go with through. It looks like I didn't include them in this deck, which is a pity. So that's one of the challenges. So fun is defined in a lot of different ways. I generally like to think of it as a sensational thing. So when we have a sensation that we like, that's fun. So if you eat something and it tastes good, that's a fun thing, right? If you eat something and it tastes bad and you feel sick, that's not fun. And fun is variable for various different people. So one example I like to give, I have a slide that again, I don't have this stuff in this deck, unfortunately. I have a slide that shows like a few different things like Candyland, raking leaves, playing tic-tac-toe. These are things, and the raking leaves picture is great because you've got this little girl raking leaves with her dad, and she's got this huge smile on her face. And then the dad looks miserable. And there's like leaves falling down as he's raking them. And so it's a great example of how fun means different things for different people. And a lot of it kind of comes back to motivation theories. And so there are kind of intrinsic motivations. There's base level motivations like collecting things, like people like to earn things. But those are kind of base level motivations. And then there's higher level intrinsic motivations, which and I'm blanking on what they are. There's three specific ones, but they have to do with things like mastery, like people want to get really good at stuff. Do you guys, does anybody else remember what the other
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. So mastery is one of them, but there's motivations, there's science on motivation. And so
are you talking about autonomy, mastery, and purpose?
I think possibly, possibly. I think I probably something along those lines. And so you want to make sure you have that sort of stuff in the games, right? So you want to have the ability for somebody to, and there's game mechanics that actually map pretty well to those. I don't think I have a slide on that either. But there's game mechanics that kind of map to those different motivations, human motivations. And so, there's like exploration mechanics can map to autonomy motivations, for instance. And so trying to get those sorts of things in the games is really valuable. You look at something like a Pokemon game, it's like 100% about collection, right? And so that's great. Collecting, acquiring things is a motivation, but it's actually not the higher level motivations. So trying to appeal to higher level motivations is really valuable. And then there's actually there's research that has shown, and this was actually conducted using serious games. There's research that has shown that people are actually motivated inside their brain, the part of your brain that is used for motivation. They're motivated not by achieving goals, but by making progress towards goals. And so somebody had done some research. They used a game that was a simple chase evade game where you're trying to run around and collect coins and avoid monsters that are trying to eat you. And so they had people playing this game while they were taking brain scans of them, and they were able to show that when people when their brains lit up for that motivation section of their brain was when they were getting closer to a coin. So that as you got closer and made progress towards your goal of collecting that coin, you were getting more and more motivated. And if you had to move away from it because you had to avoid a monster and it made you lose progress towards your goal, then they became demotivated. And when they actually achieved their goal, actually collected the coin, it didn't impact anything. It didn't it didn't improve that section of the brain. So it's really not so much about achieving your goals, it's about making progress towards your goals. That's what motivates people. And so that's what I think is really what fun gets wrapped around. As I said, there's a real big challenge because everybody has different definitions of fun. There's kind of this relationship between fun and complexity. So the more complex a game is, the more fun it is until it gets to a certain point, at which point it just immediately drops off a cliff and it's not fun anymore. And the challenge there is that everybody has a different kind of complexity versus fun curve, right? So when you're putting a game together, you need to figure out a way, how do we hit that largest market as possible? And that's why for folks who are like me, who I play a lot of strategic and tactical games, and I'm like, these are all so boring because they're not hard enough, right? And complaining about how games are not hard enough all the time. And the reason for that is because these game companies, they have to make something that appeals to the wide audience. So they want to make something that's challenging, but not so challenging that only 10% or 20% of the people playing are going to think it's fun. So if you're on that side of the curve where you can enjoy a lot of complexity, you often find it's hard to find games that will have the level of complexity that you want, and that's because they need to define these games so they'll be fun to as large an audience as possible. So that's kind of a long answer, and I guess maybe not completely answering your question of how do we figure it out. A lot of that is just observation. So observing people playing games, asking them questions afterwards, and just, do they look like they're having fun? If you've got people looking like this while they're playing your game, and believe me, I've had people look like this while they're playing a game that I put together, especially like in the alpha and beta stages, then that means you've got a problem and you need to go back and you need to, tweak some of the mechanics to try to make it more entertaining.
It's a magic of games is that they're meant to be played. So the sooner you have something that can be played, the sooner you can find out if it's what you want and choose it from the paths. That's why the stakeholders going to find it fun is having a stakeholder play.
Right. And we do a lot of paper prototypes. So even when we're putting together digital games, we'll frequently start with some paper prototypes just to kind of test out the mechanics and try to, understand, does it seem like this is something that's fun to do? So I'm going to go ahead and jump to Eric. Do you want to start with the Mars game, or?
I mean, the Mars game is such a good segue after that last conversation about fun.
Okay.
So one of the projects that I worked on with Pete was we had some stakeholders come to us and we're like, hey, we want to make a game to teach people about organizational agility and train them and make sure that they understand this practice of organizational agility. And we want to facilitate these experiences where they can learn about it. So Pete and I sat down and we came up with a game, a big complex strategic game about just surviving on Mars for a period of time. I think that ultimately it was like 12 weeks that we settled on. And in order to be successful, and we had all of these like events coming at you, like 1 week there might be like a huge sandstorm that's blocking all of your solar power, and another week there might be a huge or there might be like some meteors that have hit the planet and destroyed some important resource or building that you have. And the entire time you're just trying to like research different things and optimize your ability to research and perform certain tasks that you can survive on Mars for the allotted time period. So a little bit of, I guess, a little bit of background on what organizational agility is. It's the ability to apply various sensing capabilities, such as environmental sensing, like interpersonal sensing, like within your workplace, I'm trying to remember the terms that we used, but also like sensing of technology, sensing of communication systems and organization systems. All of these different, like putting feelers out and understanding all these different topics so that you can bring them back to your organization and improve your processes as a result. So yeah, through trying to survive together as a team on this planet, you were exercising your ability to, you were actively exercising your ability to perform these different kinds of sensing and organize yourselves and cooperate with each other in order to be organizationally agile. So the game started, the game was for like 5 to 7 players, each of which was in charge of a different department. So you had like the medical team, you had the oxygen team, the food team, the water team, like all of these different groups that were each in charge of contributing some specific resource that would allow you to perform your perform your tasks. Did I miss anything in the basic explanation, Pete?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think maybe explaining some of the kind of fun elements,
Oh, yeah.
which included, well, including like the, both what we called the curveballs as well as the, we call the scenarios.
Yeah. So the scenarios are what you see on the top card here. The walking on air. That was one of those, like once a week you'll see some scenario pop up, and that will cause some major problem for your entire team. So for walking on air in particular, you can work on that. Sorry, you can come up with a resolution there. So here the resolution is to figure out a way to help your crew cope with gravitational changes. And if you'd been doing sensing and researching and all of that stuff, you'd know that there's like some artificial gravity simulator or something that can help your crew cope with these things.
And we also, with
yep.
appropriate sensing, they would actually get pre-warning about this. So they would learn about this issue before it became an issue.
Right. So they'd understand that, okay, my crew members are going to be facing this problem, and they can start researching different kinds of like technology and so on and so forth to try to help their, to know that they need to build this like artificial gravity system before the end of the next week. And then you can see the penalty is that if you don't do it, your crew members will become ill because they're like succumbing to the effects of the gravity, the lighter gravity. The other thing is the curveballs, which I believe fear of the unknown is one of them. Fear of the unknown, the curveballs, each department had its own deck of curveballs. And those we stacked, both the curveballs and the scenarios. Sorry, the curveballs. It's been like over a year since I worked on this. Both the curveballs and the scenarios were stacked in a particular order before we gave them before we started the game, in order to help, in order to make sure that things were presenting in like a balanced way. But the curveballs, every team member at the start of their turn drew a curveball. And that would affect them for that week. So it could be something like your solar panels are producing half output, or you've broken the ladder that helps you get to the oxygen system, something like that. And you have to spend some sort of resource in order to fix it. There's some plague, and you have to come up with some technology or some vaccine for it. So yeah, all of this came together in a game that would help us facilitate this understanding of organizational agility. This was a game that had a lot of playtesting, especially with our stakeholders. Our two primary stakeholders, I think, were involved in every single playtest that we did. And they just kept trying it out and offering their own ideas and so on and so forth. And it was a really cool experience. I had no idea what organizational agility was before then. I feel like I learned a lot during it. And I think this is I think that creating a board game was something that I wasn't really expecting to do at MITRE. But the reason that I was laughing earlier while Pete was talking about the complexity things and how a game can get so complex that it becomes not fun is I feel like early on in this process, we wound up making this game very, very complex so that it would take, I think, 8 hours to play. And ultimately we had to, we were through communications with the stakeholders, we were told, okay, we need to get this time down. And we were initially planning like I think like 16 weeks or something like that, and we had to cut it down to like somewhere between 8 or 12. Yeah, there was a lot of mechanics that we had to cut. Like you had specific characters that had interests that you needed to assigned to specific tasks, and we wound up cutting all of that out in favor of just having individual or just having like character time units that represented the entirety of your department, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, we did a considerable amount of simplification.
Yeah, there was a lot of simplification, but some other fun things is that in order to test the balance and the resource like allocations and stuff, I made some fun simulations that would allow us to see how many resources people are generating every turn, given certain policies being in place or certain technologies being in place. And that really helped us see what we could throw at the players at a given time. So between that and the free, because like doing 4-hour play tests very frequently was not easy. But between that and the play tests that we were able to get in, we were able to really refine that curve and make it a much more collaborative, cooperative experience.
And we did, so just Eric and I did do some alpha testing ourselves, right, just, you know, in between things, just to kind of make sure that we thought things were going to work before we pulled in a lot of other folks.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's all I have on this game.
So there's a number of other games that I could share with you. I think I mostly want to, there's one more game Eric worked on that I think I want to share. I do want to just pop this one up real quick. So this is the Happy game. This was done by another guy that Aiden and I are working with right now. This was also done in Unity. This is a really kind of cool concept because what they were doing is they were working with children with cerebral palsy, and these kids need to go get, they need to be evaluated by doctors on a regular basis, and they have to go through this big set of, you know, different body motions, and the doctors are evaluating how they're doing. And so what they did is they put together this game where in the process of playing the game, you had to, it was a connect game. So the process of playing this game, you had to actually make these motions. And so they're playing a game, making these motions because it's part of the game, and then the doctor is able to kind of evaluate them while they're playing a game. So that was kind of a cool little concept to make it a little bit easier for kids who have to go see doctors on a regular basis, make the doctor visit a little bit less annoying. So Eric, did you want to talk a little bit about the Pet Detective?
I'll keep this one quick. So this was one of the first projects that I worked on at MITRE, or actually I think it was the literal first project I worked on at MITRE. There was a serious games sort of facet earlier on for more physical games called Policy Lab. And so there was a MIP, or a MITRE Innovation Project, that was given funding to allow the creation of a digital policy lab. And so that system was, that was a game engine that would allow us to create different situations that our sponsors or stakeholders are experiencing, and then do A/B tests and randomly assign who's getting those A/B tests in order to like test different solutions, basically. So Ace Pet Detective was one game that was developed with that. One of our stakeholders came to us and they were having a time reporting problem where they had two different time entry systems, and they needed both of them for their purposes, but they weren't sure how to motivate people to use them, because people would fill out one and not the other, or vice versa. So we developed a game called Ace Pet Detective, the goal of which was to figure out there was some crime involving someone's pet, and you need to figure out which of the suspects at the top of the screen did it. And you do that by exploring the neighborhood, clicking on people, getting information about where the crime took place, and by going to those different locations that people would point out, you would be able to put those clues together to solve the crime. And each of these actions that you could do, such as the investigate actions at the bottom, or visit or canvassing the neighborhood, would allow you to, would take up some amount of time. And so the game starts the game starts at some designated time. Here you can see the current time is 10 o'clock, and it would end at I think midnight that day. So you had until midnight to figure out who the person who committed the crime is. So the main thing that we wanted people to do was every time they did an action, they had to log when they started that action and when they and what the action was. So that and in doing so, for our like control group, we didn't have any benefit for doing so. But in having the experiment groups, we had alternative incentives, such as like, hey, if you do your time reporting, these actions might take less time, or if you do your time reporting, you might become more proficient at certain things. So we wanted to test different messaging to see what wording we could use or what incentives we could provide that would allow people to report their time. And I think ultimately what we found is that nobody wanted to report their time ever.
Right. So this was not a particularly successful serious game, but people found it to be very fun. So it was a game, at least, and it did help us understand a little bit more about like how challenging this problem was going to be for our sponsor in doing this dual time reporting system, and that it was really going to be hard to get people to ever accept that they would have to enter their time twice.
I mean, we did ultimately find out that we were able to accurately simulate their problem.
Yes.
So that's a benefit, but yeah.
Right. We accurately simulated the problem. The control group behaved exactly the way that they were behaving in real life. And unfortunately, the experimental groups didn't behave that much differently. So
so yeah, I guess we should open the floor for questions in the last like 4 minutes that we have.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to ask questions.
We do have a question in the chat asking if these slides will be public, Pete.
We're recording it.
Yeah.
So the recording will be made public.
Yep. All right. Doesn't look like anybody's raising their hand or typing anything, but we can give them a few more minutes to think about it.
Oh, and I do want to throw out the pitch. We are actively recruiting and hiring. So if folks are interested in kind of doing the serious games thing, and also interested in just potentially working for a federally funded research development center that does government work, we are actively hiring. We generally are looking for folks that have a computer science background or IMGD with a computer science kind of focus, because none of us are able to spend 100% of our time doing serious games, unfortunately.
I haven't worked on a game in over a year at this point. But yeah, I saw Varun raise his hand if he wants to unmute and ask his question.
Oh, it's fine. It won't be a quick question.
Go ahead, ask it anyway. If it's not a
Okay.
quick question, I'll talk to you later.
Okay. It's just that when you're talking about simulations and games in general, when you're talking about serious games and modeling, when you're talking about this, how do you ensure like transference, and how do you ensure like the participation is actually leading to learning and not like short-term performance? Do you do like different ways of practice? Like, do you interleave practice, or do you do like segmented practice, or do you do like block practice methods, or do you do anything like that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions in there. So yes, we can do all of those things. We do try to do some experimentation, but a lot of that goes above and beyond what our budgets can pay for. So that's one of the challenges we're facing on the Now We're Talking project right now. We want to be doing some tests of efficacy, but that requires a number of users over a long span of time to test the game out and just to make sure exactly what you're talking about. Is it just a short-term learning thing, or is it a long-term learning that's happening? So testing the effectiveness of a game is a project in and of itself. And so that's something that we would like to do more of, and we do it sometimes to a certain extent, but it usually ends up coming down to funding limitations. I guess one of the things I also didn't share this slide that kind of talks about some of the benefits of serious games. But serious games have a number of benefits to doing something like education. One thing that we can do is we can remove a lot of bias through the use of serious games. And we did that in the Mars project by taking people out of their normal environment, moving them to another environment, and having them kind of do parallel activities and processes that they do in their real world, in their real life, but doing it somewhere else to kind of helps remove some biases, provides that kind of safe environment. But a big thing for learning is that it provides an experiential environment. So you're learning you're not just doing passive learning, sitting back and having something be told to you. You're actually learning by doing, right? So as you're learning lessons, you're immediately applying those lessons as you're in doing future actions in the game, right? So you learn, oh, this was something that was bad. This is the bad game action that came out of it. Let me not do that again. And applied learning, I believe, has been shown to be a pretty effective way of teaching people.
Right.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thanks. That actually answered a couple of other questions as well. So thank you.
All right. Awesome. Yeah, I saw a question in the chat about how to go about applying to MITRE, and I responded with a link to our Workday job site. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And do you guys want to also include yourselves on that? I don't know, but worst case, if you have any questions about MITRE at all, feel free to reach out to me at the very least. I put my email in the chat as well.
I extend the same offer. I'm also still drifting through the IGDA and IMGD discords as well. If you want to reach out to me less formally, I'll direct you to my email as well.
I'm also technically in the IMGD Discord. Not that I ever post in there.
So and I don't know where the chat is right now because I'm presenting, but that's my contact information if anybody is interested. I generally don't do stuff through LinkedIn. They just maybe put that on the slide. So email's a little bit better.
I also don't do anything with LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, it was very nice to meet you this evening. Eric and Aiden, it was nice to see both of you again. Peter, I hope you had a chance to play Eric's Escape Room because it was very fun.
I don't think I have played that yet.
Well, I did give a talk on it.
You did?
Okay.
Okay.
But yeah.
And yeah, I hope that people will reach out to you and that here I can share my video again. I know it's weird when I'm talking and no one can see me. I hope that people have a chance to reach out to you, but also thank you for coming back. I know that I've sent students to MITRE before for internships and so forth, and you guys have been great.
Great. Yeah. And certainly we encourage more interest, like I said, we don't get to do game stuff every day, but we do make use of our skills and we get to do some, I think, pretty impactful work with games. So.
And I'll say even on the projects that I've worked on that aren't game projects specifically, I've done stuff that IMG has been super helpful for. I've done non-game work in stuff like Unreal and Unity. I've just had things I learned in IMG classes about scope and design that have been super useful in other projects. So even the stuff that isn't a game per se, it really does expand a lot past the domain you might think about using it. There's a lot more overlap in, especially with the intersectionality MITRE has, than I think is evidently like right and obvious out there.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, everyone have a good evening. Thank you very much. I clap. No one can clap in a way that you hear because Zoom is a bizarre thing. And I look forward to collaborating with you again in the future.
Sounds great.
Have a good evening then.
You too.
Right. Bye. Thank you everyone for coming out.